joining us today to discuss the research needs of the small-eye and sharp-nosed shiners and other prairie fishes. This public meeting is being recorded and we'll make it available at its conclusion so you can review it and share it with all your friends who missed it. My name is Colin McDonald and I'm with the Texas Comptroller's Office. Before we get to the main attraction, I'm going to take care of some basic housekeeping, explain why the State Tax Office is interested in small fish, and outline our goals for the meeting. The housekeeping is simple. You're all on mute. On your screen, you should see these symbols. This bubble people button will show you the list of everyone at the meeting. This cartoon speech bubble will allow you to write a message to any of them individually or to the entire group. You can use the reaction button to raise your hand if you'd like to address the group. Once you do raise your hand, we will call on you just like we were back in middle school. You will then need to unmute your microphone, which is easy enough to do by clicking on the little microphone icon, which looks like this. My colleague, Chelsea Jones, who is writing hello in the conversation now, is standing by to help with any technical issues. Please reach out to her or myself directly if you have any trouble. Finally, if you are having problems hearing everyone or we are having trouble hearing you, please call in. You can find this number and passcode in the Outlook invitation, and Chelsea will post it to the conversation. So why is the Comptroller's Office hosting this meeting? The federal and state policy implications from the listing of the small-eye and sharp-nosed shiners under the Endangered Species Act impacts everything from highways and pipelines to water supply and treatment plans. Uncertainty in our understanding of these species translates into uncertainty in these policies. Our goal is to minimize that uncertainty because that uncertainty is disruptive to the health of the Texas economy. We found over the last 10 years of working on these types of issues and funding research across Texas that when everyone has access to the same data, that data is up to date and accurate, and it's representative and broadly understood, it's much easier to find sustainable solutions ecologically, economically, and socially. We are not interested in short-term solutions or a response to any particular regulatory action. Our goal here is regulatory stability through effective and efficient compliance with federal and state law. We are here today because we need your help. The value of our work is directly tied to the quality and utility of the data these listing decisions and voluntary conservation plans are built on. Our goal with this meeting is to advance the conversation about the small eye and sharp nose with a broad audience that includes all the stakeholders from the regulators to the regulated. We need to draw from all of your expertise to understand what the priority research questions are. The Comptroller's Office can then help fund and kickstart that research. But this only works if there is involvement from the stakeholders. We can't fund research to address your questions if we don't know what those questions are. Likewise, the data we gather does not serve a purpose if it cannot be used by the stakeholders. Further, researchers can be much more efficient in the field if they can draw on the knowledge of locals. You may be surprised, but basic information such as river access points or dam operation often eludes them. We need everyone's help. Our presenters will cover the history of the listing of the small eye and sharp-nosed shiners, and you will see that we are dealing with issues that are decades old. My hope is that you will all see this meeting as an opportunity to plan for and start to move towards where we want to be decades from now. To quote my boss's boss's boss, Comptroller Glenn Hager, by working together, we can protect our economy and our environment better than the federal government or any single interest group. That's why the legislature has tasked my office with taking the lead on this crucial work. As you'll see in the agenda, this meeting has two main parts. The first hour is for our friends at the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service and Texas Parks and Wildlife Department to give an overview of the research they have funded on these species and the current policies for them. At 11 a.m., we will take a 5-minute break. When we return, we will have a discussion about what the priority research questions are. Then that'll be followed by what's the best way to address them and the next steps. Each presentation will be followed by a Q&A. You are welcome to submit your questions during the presentation, but we will address them at the end of each presentation. So unless there are any questions for me, I will turn the microphone over to Omar Bocanegra, a supervisory fish and wildlife biologist based out of the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service's field office in Arlington. Omar has graciously agreed to be here today to provide an overview of the status of the shiners and his agency's needs to move forward with the conservation of the species. So I don't see any questions. So Omar, you ready to go?
Yeah, I think so. Can you see my screen now?
Yes, sir. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks, Colin. I appreciate it. And I appreciate you and the Comptroller's Office hosting the meeting and getting everybody together to talk about research on the sharp nose and small eye shiner. I prepared just a short presentation here to talk about status of the species, a little bit of the biology. And I've also got from our office, Robert Allen and Brian Small, who can pitch in. They're co-authors of the draft recovery plan, and they can help me out as necessary. So to start off here, there's the two species that we're talking about, the sharp-nosed shiner, the small eye shiner, two native Texans, freshwater minnows occurring in the Brazos River currently. And this is our range here of Texas for the sharp-nosed shiner. Historically, we did some research to find out all the places that occurred in Texas. And the three river basins, Red River, Brazos River, and Colorado River basins, are where it historically occurred. They're represented in red to the extent of the collections that were made and reasonably expected to occur there in the past. Right now, the sharp-nosed shiner is currently limited to the upper Brazos region. The small eye shiner has limitations only to the Brazos River basin, and you can see it represented here in red. The Colorado River basin there's a small reintroduction, or at least what we think was a bait fish reintroduction around the Austin area, but it doesn't exist there anymore. Small eye shiner is still currently limited to the upper Brazos region right now. So a brief timeline for the shiners. In 91, there was a publication that believed that the small eye was extinct in Texas, and the sharp nose was known to be declining. After that, the Fish and Wildlife Service put a Section 6 grant out to Texas Parks and Wildlife Department. And in 1993, Moss and Mays published a report and rediscovered the small eye shiner and discovered that both species were basically limited to upstream of Possum Kingdom in the Brazos River. A few sharp nose were collected, about 27 were collected in the lower Brazos at that time. 2002, the Fish and Wildlife Service added the two species to our candidate list for listing under the Endangered Species Act. And in 2014, they were listed as endangered with critical habitat. Last year in December, we put out a draft recovery plan for both species. I went through a 30-day public review, and we're currently revising it right now for the final recovery plan. So this is what it looks like right now, the ranges. The red lines represent the upper Brazos region, the Double Mountain Fork, the Main Stem, and the Salt Fork. And Possum Kingdom Reservoir is the limits of their range. That red area also represents the critical habitat area, which is about 623 miles. So just some brief life history on the two shiners. They're known as broadcast spawners. Both eggs and spawn directly are put into the water for fertilization. Eggs float in the water column for about 1 to 2 days before they hatch. The larvae are also suspended in the water column for a few days before they become free swimming themselves. And right now, current velocity in the streams during their peak spawning season is believed to be 92 and 227 cubic feet per second. That is because the eggs and the larval fish need to float in the water column. There needs to be some stream flow in there to keep them suspended. Otherwise, they float to the bottom and they're covered up by silt or they're predated on. So 92 cubic feet per second for the sharp nose and 227 cubic feet per second for the small eye. And that's an average over the spawning season that includes both base flows and pulse flows. So considering that they float in the stream, they're floating down before they become free swimming, it's estimated that they need about 171 miles of unobstructed stream to complete that life cycle, or at least to have high reproductivity and recruitment into the population. Reservoirs, among other things, represent a barrier to downstream movement. For the upstream population, which is the only existing one, Possum Kingdom, represents a barrier to that movement downstream because they can't float anywhere else. So our current status of the species and why they were listed, primarily river fragmentation by impoundments, alteration of the natural stream flow, which is also caused by impoundments, and drought, groundwater withdrawal, and salt cedar encroachment. Basically, they need that long stretches of river. They need it to be unobstructed. They need wide streams with flowing water. Secondarily, we also believe that water quality may have something to do with their threats, in-stream mining and dredging, and golden alga blooms. So I mentioned in 2020, at the end of the year, we put out a draft recovery plan. The vision was to have more than one single resilient population across the historic range that represents genetic diversity and diversity of habitats. So just briefly, in the recovery plan, we divided up the upper Brazos to where they currently exist into management units, those three major forks, the main stem, the Salt Fork, and the Double Mountain Fork. And we believe that the things that are important in managing those units are stream length, stream flow, water quality, monitoring, and captive propagation. For complete delisting of the species we'll talk about in a second, an additional management unit is probably going to be necessary also. So we divided up our recovery plan, our draft recovery plan, into two segments. What we think would represent downlisting, and then what we would think would represent delisting. The downlisting objectives could be pretty much handled within the current range of the species. That is everything upstream from Possum Kingdom. Excuse me. And what we think that looks like is a self-sustaining population. That is, that population that exists right now is resilient. We have a captive population. That is a population in refugia within a fish hatchery that could be used to supplement supplement the existing population if necessary. Adequate stream flow, adequate water quality, and restore that habitat in the upstream where it needs it to represent historical morphology. Delisting for the two shiners, at least to remove them from the list, we'd like to meet all the downlisting objectives and then add that another self-sustaining population within the historical range of the species. And then, of course, habitat sufficient to support both those populations. Yeah, I'd like to talk a little bit about some of the recovery actions that we're working on right now. This is a type of barrier that we're talking about, or at least a partial barrier within the critical habitat that would need to be improved if we're going to have unobstructed stream length within the range. This is a culvert crossing in Kent County, I believe on the Double Mountain Fork. You can see right here under low flow conditions, shiners, at least at times of the year, couldn't move up and down the river. And through work with the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, TCEQ, our fish hatcheries, and putting in some money, and the Corps of Engineers, we were able to get this one removed and allow it to flow again. Another example, this right here from Google Earth looks like it could be a low water crossing over the main stem of the Brazos upstream of Possum Kingdom in Throckmorton County. But what it actually is a remedy for this 6-inch crude oil pipeline that was crossing the river and it became exposed. So this is an older pipeline built in the 70s, started to rise and became exposed, which is a hazard. And the remedy was to sink it back down with this concrete mattress, which is a little bit bigger than the actual pipeline itself, and created a partial fish barrier. And you can see here under low flow conditions, it presents a barrier for fish moving back and forth.
Omar, I apologize for interrupting you. Is anyone else not seeing, or is anyone not seeing Omar's slides? I'm seeing them, but there's a message in the conversation that folks aren't seeing it.
I can see it. Mike here, I can see it.
Okay. All right. I'm sorry, Omar. Please carry
That's
on.
right. So anyway, so this particular pipeline and this obstruction within a very important area within the Brazos River took years of planning and negotiation with several entities, including the Corps of Engineers, Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, to get it removed. And here it is right after the removal of that. They re-drilled that pipeline underneath the river and took out that barrier. Here's a road crossing in Stonewall County. Texas Department of Transportation would like to redo the bridge because it's getting old and a safety hazard. And through this consultation over critical habitat for the species, we also noticed that there was an obstruction here within the Brazos River. It's a part of an old bridge built in the early 1900s that had fallen in the river many years ago. And you can see it's collecting sediment and creating an island out there and starting to encroach upon the stream. And this is it on the ground. And through work with TxDOT, we asked them if they were able to remove that, and they said they could. And we're working on that right now to get that obstruction removed, and hopefully natural stream pulses and storm discharges will remove that island over time. We're also working with Texas Parks and Wildlife Department on salt cedar removal. This is the Upper Brazos area. Sorry for the quality of that PDF. The black dots represent areas where we are treating salt cedar. From 2016 to 2019, almost 14,000 acres have been treated on private lands up against where the river and the riparian area. I think to date, we're almost up to 20,000 acres have been treated. And then research. So coming up after my talk, Kevin Mason, Parks and Wildlife, one of our partners, is going to be talking about the research that's ongoing right now a little bit more in depth. But just as a background here for what's coming up, recently funded by the Fish and Wildlife Service, we've had a few studies. One that finished up a few years ago, groundwater and surface water interaction in the Upper Brazos. We also funded a study on water quality in the Upper Brazos. And right now we have two ongoing prairie stream fishes studies, ecological forecasting and movement ecology. And those deal with several different Great Plains fishes, including the two shiners. And so we're looking forward to the results of those. Kevin Mays is going to talk a little bit more in depth about what's going on with these projects. Research needs. So in our draft recovery plan, we have criteria in there which are measurable and we think are necessary as a guidance document to be able to consider downlisting and delisting of the species. And so there's some ideas in there about what we would need and how we would look at measuring success for the species and recovery of the species. So anything that can represent looking at our current conditions and future conditions of the species is helpful. Drought climate modeling, which we may be getting on some of the studies that are ongoing right now, is necessary. The fish need water. They're in a place that's arid. Long-term outlooks is not good. So anything that we can do to focus on that and get more accurate information on the future conditions of the species would be helpful. Recovery needs for the species. Focusing on improving what does recovery look like, how the species are going to exist in their current range, and then maybe other parts of their historical range. As I already said, future and current conditions, that's how we structure our assessments for the species, what their current condition looks like, what's the future condition look like, anything that supports those information that'll support that. And then a population viability analyses. We're looking for information on what does viability look like. One of the measurable criteria that we have now is a 50-year timeline and looking at whether a species is viable if it has less than a 10% chance of extinction within that 50 years. And to have that information, a PVA would be very helpful. Captive propagation. We think right now, recovery looks like having a captive population is necessary. We've had some preliminary work done on that, but husbandry techniques to maintain the shiners in captivity, reintroduce the shiners, what all the information that it takes to do those things, how much is it going to cost? We're interested in that research and being able to get that kickstarted. And then water quality. So it's important that they have clean water, non-polluted water. So we're looking at evaluating impacts of the discharges up in that area, both point and non-point sources, and making sure that the thresholds for contaminants in that area or water quality are protective of the shiners. And with that, looks like I'm getting close to my 20-minute mark. I've got our website listed right there. You can find the draft recovery plan there, as well as a lot of other information about the shiners, including our 2018 revised species status assessment. But I'll take any questions if you have any now.
All right. Thank you, Omar. That was a wonderful overview. If we'll give it one more pregnant pause to see if there's any questions in the chat. I don't see any.
Colin, we have some folks raising their hand. I don't mind calling them out and
yeah, please.
unmuting them. So starting with Jill, let's see if you can unmute, ask your question.
Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks for that presentation. Really appreciated. Just wanted to note that, I think the studies on the water quality thresholds are really needed. This is a very, as has been noted, this is an extremely variable system that's prone to extreme changes, from heat and lack of stream flow, salinity, all of that stuff. So with all of that natural variability, any specific studies that could really look at the requirements of the species in terms of water quality would certainly help.
All right. Thank you, Jill. Yeah, we'll discuss about that more in the discussion. Any other hands? Okay. Then I would thank you again, Omar. Looking forward to more discussion about all these specifics in the broader picture here. But now for aquatic biologist for the Inland Fisheries River Studies Program at the Texas Parks and Wildlife Department, Kevin Mays. Kevin has been working on shiner research and conservation for more than 30 years, and there is no better person to provide us an overview of what has happened, what is happening, and the current ideas for what the needs to come next. Kevin, please take it away.
All right. Can you hear me okay, Colin?
Yes, sir.
All right. And you see my screen?
Yes.
All right. Well, good morning. Thank you, Colin, for inviting me to provide information on TPWD perspectives on our roles and science needs. And I appreciate everyone here that is an interest in conserving native fishes in the Brazos River. I got a lot of ground to cover, so I'm going to get started. Regulatory oversight by Parks and Wildlife of scientific and zoological collections, fish stockings, commercial fishing, disturbances to state-owned stream beds, exotic species management, all of these regulatory roles outlined in this table assures that no adverse impacts occur to state threatened and endangered freshwater fishes. Under Section 12 of the Parks and Wildlife Code, the department is charged with providing recommendations that will protect fish and wildlife resources to local, state, and federal agencies that approve, permit, license, or construct developmental projects. Next. For example, our wildlife division habitat assessment program reviews permits for construction and development projects. They provide information and planning tools to agencies and private organizations that make decisions affecting fish and wildlife. For example, the diversity program maintains the natural diversity database and an online tool called RTest that annotates county lists for rare, threatened, and endangered species known to occur or potentially occur in Texas. A couple other consultation roles include, among other duties, the Coastal and Inland Fisheries Division's consultation on applications for surface water rights, discharge permits, and hydropower licenses. TPWD has a myriad of conservation programs in line with more voluntary authorities, ranging from national fish habitat partnerships, endangered species and state wildlife grant funding programs, and establishing native fish conservation areas and networks. Some of those will be highlighted as I go through this talk. So that's an overview of the roles that we play in regulations, but a little bit of background. Some of this will be redundant with what Omar said, but I prefer that in order to be comprehensive and complete in my presentation. So the Brazos River is one of the longest rivers in Texas, spanning from New Mexico through the heart of Texas to the Gulf of Mexico. There are 4 main stem impoundments and nearly 40 tributary impoundments. And we have over 60 native freshwater fishes have been reported to date. Some of these are fishes native to the Brazos that are members of the Pelagic Broadcast Spawning Reproductive Guild that Omar talked about, and some of the requirements associated with those. These species are what we consider emblematic of Great Plains prairie stream ecosystems. 2 of these are native Texans, and I will use to illustrate the life history strategies common to these minnows, with all due respect to the complexity of their reproductive cycles and the evolutionary history of this guild. Each species is unique, and it's complicated. To reiterate some of the requirements, they do have a short lifespan, typically 2 years. They are broadcast spawning minnows. The spawning season is roughly April through September, although you could get something earlier, you might get something later. Some years you may not get spawning until May or June, depending. Flowing river reaches long enough to support ova and larval drift, and wide, shallow, sandy habitat, and natural flow regimes for spawning and recruitment. Omar covered that ground pretty well. I'm also going to cover some of the timeline that Omar talked about. Both were originally found throughout the Brazos River and the Wichita River for the sharpnose. Colorado, there's still some questions about whether or not sharpnose shiners are indeed native to the Colorado River. And as Omar noted, small-eye shiner was once thought to be extinct, but some of the work that Dr. Randy Moss and I worked on confirmed both were abundant in the upper Brazos, absent from the middle, with low numbers of sharpnose in the lower Brazos, and no longer present in the Wichita River, and we did not find any small-eye shiners in the lower. Federal candidates since 2002, and important to note here that basically that was around the same timeline that Texas Tech, Dr. Gene Wild's lab, began long-term monitoring and research. And much of the work and the presentations that I show today are going to be associated with his lab. So the species are now restricted to the upper Brazos River watershed, as Omar indicated. One more element of the timeline here is in 2011, there was a drought. There was a discharge of 0 CFS for 46% of the spawning season at the Seymour gauge. So it resulted in intermittent pools, record low precipitation, record heat, etc. So it was a very stressful time. We decided it was serious enough that we would embark on a shiner rescue to make sure that we at least had some captive populations in case the river completely dried up. We collected approximately 3,000 sharp-nosed and small-eye shiners, and we transported them to the Possum Kingdom State Fish Hatchery. 300 of each were taken to Texas Tech to, one, maintain a second captive population, and to conduct captive spawning research and associated applications. The now famous pictures were taken during this event by my colleague Clint Robertson at Parks and Wildlife. And Possum Kingdom State Fish Hatchery. These minnows overwintered here in this pond right there, and they did very well. We drained the pond in May of 2012. The females were plump, full of eggs. And so we just, key point also is that during 2011, in the fall, the rains returned, so we stopped going out there to collect fishes, and we decided this was the place to keep them. Populations have since rebounded, but in May, I decided that it was best to put these in the lower Brazos River rather than back in the upper Brazos, since the rains had returned up there. So cooler by cooler, tempered them, acclimated, and we released them into the lower Brazos River near Hearn. About 800. I did not want to create unnecessary stress on the fish by counting them, going, okay, we got 432 of these and 381 of these. It was just best to get them to the river as quickly as we could. And following that, in 2014, as Omar noted, they were listed as endangered. The service identified critical habitat as well. He noted some of the primary factors and secondary factors. One of them also was commercial harvest for bait fish. And following the listing, one of the first things that TPWD did was to review our non-game fish permitting and to provide guidance to our permit team, and to recommend that no minnow harvest or devices be used in reaches with species of greatest conservation need, including those listed as state threatened and endangered. And you see here that it does include the upper Brazos as well as the lower Brazos, parts of the Red River and the Canadian River, or South Canadian. And since this time of the map, we have added the South Canadian below Lake Meredith. So I'm going to shift gears into research and highlight some of the key elements out there. There's many other studies and labs that are doing work in the Great Plains. I'm going to talk about some of the things that I think are key. Some of them were funded by Parks and Wildlife and others were not. They were taken on by labs or funded from other sources or in other areas. One of the key discussion items is fragment length and its relationship to the extirpation or conservation status of pelagic spawning minnows. Dudley and Platania reported on this relationship in the Rio Grande and Pecos rivers, noting extirpation from all reservoirs and from nearly all short fragment and reaches that were less than 100 kilometers. But some fraction of those assemblages persisted in all the longer reaches, greater than 100 kilometers. And that's why you see that line there at 100. Perkin and Guido, following on that, found that stream fragment length was a predictor of the conservation status of Great Plains pelagophilic cyprinids and observed that mean fragment lengths were least, lowest for extirpated and declining populations, indicated here in the red, and the greatest for the more stable populations over here in the green. That work was done in Kansas, Oklahoma, and Texas. Now, I added those colors to try to provide a little bit of guidance on what these graphs mean in a very interpretable manner. Perkin and Guido's work did not include the Upper Brazos or the Brazos River. So in 2013, Wild and Urbanzik published a paper on that relationship between fragment length and persistence of smalleye and sharp-nosed shiner. Similarly, I've added the green and red boxes here. It's a different axis presentation, so the response is in a different direction than the previous two. So the higher numbers represent probability, a higher probability that they would be there, associated with longer river fragment lengths. And then where we have short fragment lengths, they basically no longer occur in those less than 275 kilometers or something along those lines. This middle zone is a key research need. Now, hydrology is a subject I could spend a couple of weeks talking about for the Great Plains, but today I'm going to focus on some of the key flow ecology relationships. Not all of them are. I'm not even able to discuss all of those today, but the one of significance is the discharge model that Bart Durham and Gene Wild developed for smalleye and sharp-nosed shiners that uses a Leslie matrix population dynamics model. That table to the left are the parameters that they used for smalleye shiner. And they used a discharge to parameterize the survival of age 0 fishes. And then they basically validated that model or calibrated it using the catch per unit effort data from the field on smalleye shiner. And so the white line is the field data and the discharge model is the prediction of using that population dynamics model. And so that's how we ended up that 220 CFS was an average across the mean summer for May through September. You might see other months elsewhere, even in other parts of this talk, but that's the range for these models. So 227 CFS at Seymour gauge for smalleye, 92 CFS for sharp-nose. And importantly, during periods of drought, using the data from Wild's work and others, that basically they report that when the flows stop, recruitment stops, and which means these fish need flowing water habitats to persist. Addressing some of that impact, Walliver in 2019 looked at the changes in the mean summer discharge, note the difference in the months, and performed a breakpoint analysis on multiple gauges in the Upper Brazos River to try to elucidate what factors were contributing to the noted hydrologic alteration. Zooming in on the Brazos River at Seymour, there was a significant breakpoint in the mean spawning season volumes around the year 1992. Many factors could be influencing this relationship, including reservoir construction, groundwater pumping, land use changes such as salt cedar invasion, and indeed climate variability. Now, Walliver et al. Is working on a publication to get this out into a journal. So I've covered several topics on hydrology, flow ecology. There's a lot more out there, including work being done by folks here on the call related to regional relationships from work across the Great Plains, the relationships to drought, the role of flow reversals on the extirpation sequence of fishes from the middle and lower Brazos. But the next thing I want to, and so I really don't have the time to go through all of that. And the next thing I want to focus is on what if you look at both fragmentation and hydrologic alteration in fish assemblages of the Great Plains. And Perkin et al. In 2015 found that fragmentation, damming, and dewatering led to reduced diversity of fishes in the Great Plains. This diversity was greatest in fragments characterized by longer longitudinal lengths, higher mean discharge, and infrequent, less than 10% of the time that those reaches were desiccated or days dry, percentage of days dry, as in the right graph here. This is one of the graphics for the small-bodied pelagophils, which are the minnows that we're talking about. There were quite a few other guilds that were also part of this that responded variably to these parameters. I highlight the key recommendation from that report if we are to conserve the fish diversity in the Great Plains. Headed towards long-term monitoring, this is fish collections have been made across the upper Brazos. These sites have been studied consistently since 2002 by the Wild Lab on an annual basis for most of these sites, and 5 of these on a shorter time step, monthly to quarterly. And many of these sites here are also represented in the Moss and Mays report of 93 that I mentioned earlier. Brazos River at Seymour, for example, which is the heart of the distribution of these minnows. One of the results of our analysis of fish assemblages is to combining the data sets of Moss and Mays and the work of Wild's lab. We looked at the relative abundance of fishes through time. Not my favorite metric, but is what we could use given the data set. We do show declines in the pelagophils, which are pretty much these species over here. However, the shoal chub did not show a significant response. Silver chub was last reported in the Moss and Mays report in the upper Brazos in about, well, that report was 93. So increasers included species like red shiners, red river pupfish, western mosquito fish. So this is an example of what we can do using long-term monitoring data. This represents work from 2002 to 2018 from the Wild Lab, but more on that later. Water quality wise, we have done a study on the upper Brazos led by Marty Kelly. This is in the Salt Fork. That is not snow on the banks. That is salt. And the water there can at times be greater than that of the ocean. Not surprisingly, this map on the left is where Marty collected water samples and fish tissues to assess the water quality in those 4 sites of the Brazos River. Water quality parameters included in situ measurements and over 40 chemistry lab parameters. 2 metals of concern were selenium and arsenic because of their effects on aquatic organisms. To no surprise to many of you, when you look at all of those parameters in a non-metric MDS, you see that the Salt Fork really shakes out quite differently from the Double Mountain Fork and the Brazos, although indicating the variability that Jill brought up recently. So quickly, in the total selenium in water, there were some exceedances in our water samples of the TCQ chronic criteria and the EPA criteria. However, we did not get any hits in fish tissue on selenium, total selenium. Dissolved arsenic, there were no exceedances of TCQ standards for arsenic in water for acute or chronic effects to aquatic life. But you can see some of the variability out in the landscape. The Salt Fork there in red being notable in 2018. And we don't know why such a strong hit was there. We also looked at fish tissue, and we used some surrogate species. Rather than doing the analysis on endangered species, sharpnose and smalleye, we chose the plains minnow here in this picture, for example. It's a short-lived minnow, it's similar, different genus, but we thought it was a pretty good surrogate. We also used red river pupfish and some killifish as well. Total arsenic, chromium, copper, lead, and mercury were all detected in fish tissue samples across those 4 sites at levels that do raise concern. We don't understand the routes of exposure, but and again, to note that selenium was not reported in fish tissue at concerning levels, but we think there's a research need to better understand food sources and the selenium concentrations in food sources for the minnows. There has been some work done on adult tolerances of smalleye and sharpnose, on DO, temperature, and salinity through the wild lab. And we did a little bit of work on juvenile and larvae at the research lab that I'm going to talk about next, but there's still plenty of work to be done there. Captive propagation and repatriation. Wild's lab built this facility in around 2015, 2016 to facilitate research on captive propagation. It's located at Texas Tech in the Institute of Environmental and Human Health. It's currently not in operation. But the applications are captive spawning propagation techniques, conservation genetics, tolerance studies, repatriation experiments. A couple of key findings. Aaron Urbanzik out of Gene's lab, developed strip spawning techniques where we inject the fish with carp pituitary extract, strip the eggs and sperm out, mix it up, put them in aquaria with aeration, and then grow them out in stock tanks. One of the findings from his work was that you could inject and strip females, return them to aquaria for recovery, inject and strip them again with some loss in the number of ovae, but still viable numbers for research and production. Survival of larvae showed similar trends, and to date, Aaron worked out techniques for 10 prairie stream fishes, many that we've talked about today. Another aspect and outcome is to assess the conservation genetics. Ryan Vasquez is working on his dissertation. He kindly shared this table with me. This is fairly complicated, but it is through time showing that the genetic diversity across these microsatellites has decreased, especially following the drought of 2011. That would be these down here. And so the take home is that since the drought, there was a drop in genetic diversity, but another key finding was that for both of these species, it appears to be a panmictic population, meaning that for captive programs, we could collect shiners from any part of the river to represent the genetic diversity. So there's not multiple populations within the upper Brazos for small eye and sharp nose. So one of my key questions is, how do we scale up from lab, from troughs to McDonald jars, from stock tanks to ponds, from coolers to hatchery trucks, to facilitate research and refugia? This refugia is for a federally endangered species, the Rio Grande silvery minnow, Hypognathus amorous in New Mexico. Similar concepts may work for shiners and chubs, but noting the diversity in life histories. So there's a few things on ongoing conservation science that that we are currently funding, and one of them is on movement ecology by Josh and his student at Texas A&M, to observe the movements of marked individuals of 6 different species in Canadian red and Brazos rivers, develop movement models for all those stream segments and for each species, and then relate those models to species distribution modeling that is being conducted under this next one, which is called Ecological Forecasting and Conservation Planning for Great Plains fishes in Texas. And these are the objectives, and one of them here is, how will projected changes influence populations, and where are current and future refugia located? I'm hoping this will provide us some indication of where might be the best places to repatriate species as well. The next one is assessing pathways of non-native fishes. Gulf killifish, for example, is found in the Brazos River. It's a known piscivore. Sheep's head minnow has invaded the upper Brazos, and we're concerned about its role in hybridizing with our native endemic Red River pupfish. We have some research going on with salt cedar management and research, salt cedar management in the upper Brazos, including riparian monitoring, hydrologic and hydraulic and habitat monitoring that TPWD is leading. I'm going to step through. The benefits include not only riparian habitat and river function, but also improving base flows. To date, we've treated over 15,000 acres. This is a map from that through 2018. And one of our hurdles is lining up new landowners. All right, so we want to treat more. We want to do more up there. We want to expand to other river basins, but we need to identify new landowners. We do have a network of groundwater wells in place that report data, and we collect that data online through the UT Bureau of Economic Geology. They also developed a water budget and a water availability model, reported here in Mays et al. 2019, and some of the reports and publications in the work. But water yield from salt cedar treatment at the 75% reduction level within the Double Mountain Fork ranges up to about 37,000 gallons per acre. That's what the model's telling us. There's still more work and to be done on that, and we're continuing to collect data. I want to talk about research needs. It's an ongoing mission requiring adjustments to accommodate river conditions and ecology. In spring of 2016, TPWD and UT led workshops to identify and prioritize conservation needs and research objectives. We developed a website to report all of this information and to solicit new conservation and research projects, many of which were ongoing, have been funded, or even some of them have been completed today. But please visit this website and look at what the action plan is. Some of the ones I'll highlight here include establishing long-term monitoring sites across the Great Plains, identifying physical and chemical tolerances of larval and juvenile fishes, continuing work on flow ecology relationships and fragmentation, and these other things are ongoing that I've highlighted in yellow. So back to long-term ecological monitoring. This is a reminder we have valuable long-term data sets for the Brazos River. This graph on abundance of sharp-nosed shiner at those 5 sites I talked about in the other from 2008 to 2018. So we got to thank you, Dr. Wild, and all his students that worked on these surveys. So indeed, there's been various funding sources, state and federal dollars, but I really need to express my appreciation to Dr. Randy Moss, who's a great mentor and scientist, and to Dr. Gene Wild, and all of his past and current students, many of whom are on the phone call today, that have contributed to the extensive body of knowledge on the Great Plains riverscape ecology. So thank you for your time. And Colin, I can end this slideshow.
Thank you so much, Kevin. Yeah, I just posted the website you brought up to the chat, so folks can explore. It is very impressive, and it's always nice to see that how much thought has gone into this already, and we can use that to help inform this discussion. So with that, are there any questions about Kevin's specific presentation? Kevin, I did hear a couple folks asked if they could have access to your slide deck afterwards. They want to read the fine print. Would that be possible?
Absolutely.
Wonderful.
Yeah.
And then, if not, and I very appreciate for everyone for staying on schedule, but I don't see any hands or questions at this time. So let's take a break, and we will come back at 11:05 to start this discussion. So no further ado, I'll see you all soon. All right, folks, welcome back. You'll notice in the chat, in my email and Chelsea's, in case if there are any issues with the chat box, or you want to find another way to get a hold of us. But what I'd like to do now is switch to the main purpose of this, which is our the discussion about what the next what the long-term research priorities and questions are from all of our stakeholders. So would anyone like to step in? Jill, maybe we could start with you on what you brought up about water quality.
Sure. And Kevin did a good job, highlighting some of the variation that's in the system. There's also other things like brine springs that have natural sources of dissolved materials, including, even selenium, and some of those other metals. Like it's a very variable system. Such research would certainly be welcomed, and I think it's definitely needed. Also, in the first discussion, mention of the models related to stream flow, like the models are certainly a starting point, but any sort of actual measurements would also help in terms of actually defining requirements. So I think everything that we're discussing is really good and would be welcomed.
All right, thank you. And from the TCEQ, I'm going to just put you on the spot. Is there concern about more than just these species? Like, would a fish community approach be more appropriate or helpful?
That's a good question. We regulate, we regulate stream flow in terms of water rights, and we also obviously regulate pollutants, like dissolved minerals and also selenium. So that's in terms of what we manage, we manage those things. In terms of the effects that those things have, I think a community approach would be better. But that really depends on the resources we have to be able to do that.
And yeah, for Omar or Kevin or anyone in the regulated community out there, obviously Kevin showed these aren't the only fish that are up there, but these are the ones that have the attention. Is there? I mean, if we're going to be sending people out there to do seines, does it make sense to look at the community as a whole?
Colin, are you talking to me or somebody else?
I'm talking to you, and looking at Omar and Kevin, or anyone else who would like to chime in.
Well, and Colin, I'll chime in. This is Tiffany from PRA. If you're out there and you're already pulling seines, I think it's very valuable and easy to get information to go ahead and ID and take note of the size and types and condition of the other fish you're collecting. Then at least you have that data set if you ever need it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, because they're going to be there already. Omar, it looks like you're on the verge of saying something. I don't want
to. Did you catch me with my camera on?
Well, I mean, and I know it is, because this is the goal here is not, it's not what is said here is not going to be, okay, that is our plan, we're done. But what I want to do is my job here is to push the boundaries and see if there are things that are, easy consensus, or if there are, what issues need to be dived into more. Just to jump to the last part of this, my goal is to evaluate how much of a discussion needs to take place before there's a clear path forward that the comptroller's office can fund research on. All
right.
I see a hand up from Audrey. Aubrey, sorry.
Yes, hear me?
Yes.
Okay, very good. This is Aubrey Spear. I'm the Director of Water Utilities for the City of Lubbock. And
thank you for joining us.
We want to tell you that we really appreciate this additional research that you're doing. Just by way of, and we're very supportive of that. We, of course, we're very interested. We're on the very upper reach of the Brazos. If we don't put the water into the Brazos, there's not any water in the Brazos most of the time. And we're very concerned about some of the discussions about our wastewater discharge points. And those wastewater discharge points probably make up the predominant water in the stream. I mean, it's very intermittent. And we have vital water supply projects in the future, particularly one reservoir on the North Fork of the Double Mountain Fork of the Brazos, that we feel that there needs to be research and we feel that we could find scientific data that would be very supportive of us being able to continue to build reservoirs. Because a reservoir, if we build it, it's not because the water is there from natural stream flows. It's because we're putting water into that the Brazos and impounding it for reuse water. But we have some really great concerns. We're trying to determine what type of research would be helpful so that we could avoid any problems with having to move our discharge points, and something that would be a death nail in a reservoir that we may create up in our area that's vital for our human population to survive and flourish.
Very much appreciate that. And to be clear, the comptroller's office is, I mean, we're obviously involved with this issue because it does have a lot of regulatory impacts that impact a lot of people in the economy. But the research is, it's agnostic. We want to find out what the reality is, so that, because when you're dealing with that's where you will find stability. And I mean, by no means very much appreciate bring up those questions. Because obviously they're they learned about the tolerances and ability of these fish, but there's a lot. Yeah, does that? Sorry, I didn't mean to.
No, my questions are. I don't know the type of data necessarily. Y'all may know the different types of data that will be helpful for us to get the scientific information that we can work with and coexist with in our in building reservoirs and in our current discharge points and so forth. We're very supportive of getting more detailed scientific information that would be helpful for us so we can manage this whole thing.
Right. You engineers, you just love a problem. Right? Give it. Tiffany, you have your hand up?
Yeah, I just had a few thoughts too on some research topics. I really liked what Jill said about some of those water quality interactions, because we know selenium is naturally discharged with that brine water in the brine springs, but also looking at surface water, groundwater interactions in that stretch of the river. How does riverside pumping impact that? But also really, I think, what Parks is doing with their salt cedar control is awesome. And I think the more data that we have that can definitively say that is contributing to increased flows, the more likely you're going to get more landowner participation in that area. I know we did a brush control study around the Abilene area, almost 20 years ago. And really through some real defined projects on some individual ranches, we're able to kind of prove the efficacy of that. And it really went a long way to getting other folks enrolled. Now, of course, that doesn't have any impact on the Shiner, but I think something similar could be used if we can correlate reduction in salt cedar population with an increase in flows that can't be explained by, natural precipitation. That would be something really powerful to continue to support the need to continue that salt cedar control, which I think is critical for a number of reasons. And also, I really do like, and I, wasn't aware, but it would be nice if that was, some of that data was more public, that Parks had established a long-term annual monitoring program up there. Because I know there is some concern, or I would have concern if we get too many people up there, too many hands on the fish. So, I'd certainly like to see more about the project that Parks is funding.
Yeah. And thank you for that. Let's use that as a transition. Just so everyone knows, you can't touch these fish unless you're not supposed to touch these fish unless you have a federal permit and state permit. But Kevin, to cue you up, would you mind talking a little more about the long-term monitoring that was done and what kind of answers we could address if we're able to continue it?
Well, so Gene Wild's lab has prepared that data and has provided it. It is in from 2008 to 2018. We have that data in a performance report for a Section 6 grant. So that is available. If we set up these long-term monitoring sites, we can continue to, one, monitor populations and the status of imperiled species, but then continue to refine the relationships between the environmental conditions and the population of these fishes. Like I said earlier, it's rather complex, and it's not, it's not rocket science. It's far more complicated than that. And having, my paradigm is having long-term ecological monitoring across the Southern Great Plains, including the Canadian, the Red, and the Brazos, is going to be most informative and most efficient. And it would be, I think, also important that that we not deviate too much from the sampling approaches that have been laid out through Gene's work. I mean, we can improve upon, but I don't think we want to, necessarily push a completely different approach that would, raise questions about how we could do data analyses. Anyway.
And Kevin, on that, would it be possible to, to set up the design of this long-term monitoring so that it could, help get us at these questions of water quality, maybe shed some light on the effects of the brush clearing? Omar, could it help with the refining and improving the confidence in the modeling that exists, or, laying the baseline for a new model?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think that with respect to the fish community stuff, some of the early stuff that was collected by Gene Wild and Ken Ostrand in the early 2000s represented, the fish community up there. And if I recall, at that time we were going through assessment for the species on candidate listing, and the species at that time was considered fairly stable in the upper Brazos. Their representation in the fish community was relatively healthy. So that kind of represents a historical perspective, even if it was just 20 years ago, of what the fish community looked like. In the 2011-2012 drought, they took quite a hit, and they haven't rebounded, or at least one of them. I can't remember which one. I think Buckula hasn't rebounded to its pre-drought conditions. But that early stuff represents, a benchmark. And then additionally, we're interested. I think everybody should be interested in with respect to how water management occurs in the upper Brazos, of modeling and estimates of what a healthy fish community looks like, including the shiners. What does a resilient population look like? Which includes all facets of the river itself, the amount of stream flow, base flows, pulse flows, water quality, population level, and with the idea that can we predict in its current condition, is it self-sustaining now? And then can we predict out in the future based on drought and climate models? Can it be sustainable in the next 50 years or so? And then once we have that, that's one aspect, the upstream of the Brazos. And then what would a second population look like? What is within the Brazos River, or maybe the Colorado for the sharpnose? What does a separate sustainable population look like? Those are types of modeling efforts and research that I think would help to inform the recovery planning.
Eric, I see your hand up.
Yeah, morning, Colin. I just wanted to kind of echo what Kevin and Omar were saying about the long-term monitoring, the importance of that, because really that's our way of keeping our finger on the pulse of what's going on with this population. As Kevin's presentation indicated, those trends are heading down. It's a complex system, so it's hard to say which threats are really hitting these fish the hardest and at what time. It's likely to change through time. During times of drought, the flows become more of an issue, and water quality, of course, is affected as that flow goes down, because you then have point source districts are playing more of a role in terms of what's in the river and potentially impacting those fish. So it's a dynamic system that's constantly changing, and those pressures, those environmental stressors, change through time as well. But again, just reinforcing the fact that looking at trends, long-term trends, and I don't know, I'm not as tied into the native fish scene as a lot of folks on this call, but so I don't know if funding is secure for that to continue. But if not, I would say that needs to be one of the top priorities for sure.
Thank you, Eric. And just for everyone, Eric works alongside Omar at the Fish and Wildlife Service office and field office in Arlington. And yeah, so the perspective. Thank you so much, Tiffany.
I was going to say, one, I fully support Kevin's statement that, whatever and whoever does it needs to continue with the methodologies that have already been established so that you do have comparability over the long term of the data set. I was just going to throw another potential research topic out there, which it's going to be hard to do, but I know during the 2011 drought, which was a new drought of record for the upper part of our basin, we heard a lot of anecdotal reports, and there may be legitimate studies out there, I just hadn't seen it, where they felt that a lot of those shiners were kind of taking refuge in the upper end of the reservoir, which of course at that time had contracted and become more riverine. And if there's, if we go into another drought, if there's potential at that point to do some studies to see, is that true? Are there things that we can do from a conservation status on BRA property on the upper end of that reservoir that'd be beneficial? I think that's something, that could be discussed over time. We've already partnered up with Parks, and they've been treating the last couple of years of salt cedar in that area. So, that might be an interesting topic, but that's going to be very conditional. And when we start getting into another drought and start seeing flows decrease to that point where we see a change in the headwaters of the reservoir, that might be an interesting topic to have somebody on standby to go out and look at.
Right. I mean, that's obviously one of the strong advantages of long-term monitoring, is that when those events come along, you're already in position to, you already have the before and after study in place. And as anybody from that area knows, that it's either a drought or a flood. Yeah, and then just to reiterate, to make sure that I'm following along, and hopefully I'm not oversimplifying, but one of the big questions on these two fish species is obviously they are very tough. They live in a, right, I think it was Omar who said they're an aquatic species that live in an arid environment. But yeah, just how tough are they, and how much what can they handle? So thank you so much for all of that. Mark Fisher from TxDOT, I see your hand.
Yeah, I don't want to cut off the conversation of the specific research targets, because I'm going to take it a slightly different direction, but it's still in the research vein. So if anybody else has something they want to talk about in terms of water quality or hydrology or those kind of things, I want to give space for that. Hearing none, I'll phone in. So never leave a open mic open. TxDOT's perspective is a little bit different. As Omar presented on the US 83, when we work in critical habitat or in the range of endangered species, we are obligated to ensure no effect. And if there is an effect or take, then we have to find a way to compensate for that take. Traditionally, pure research has not been considered that kind of conservation action that's needed to facilitate those consultations. And so the research that I wanted to try to add some emphasis to in this is, and it may be embedded in the recovery plan, that there's some elements that could qualify as conservation action on the part of an action agency like TxDOT that we could implement. And really the bottom line goal is, implementable conservation action. Omar, Eric, I saw Charlotte and some others were on. They may not still be on the call, but the challenge for TxDOT in implementing projects is finding those conservation actions to offset what are typically temporary impacts, but in not all cases. I mean, we try to design to minimize impacts, but I think most people recognize that columns and rivers can alter hydrology, and we avoid those to the maximum extent possible, but there are engineering limitations sometimes, and we have to compensate for those effects. So bottom line, what I'm driving towards is that any research that could help identify actionable conservation efforts be it repatriation in a reach of trying to establish either the adequate population size for the primary population in the Brazos. I know Kevin mentioned that the genetics seem to be solid, that you could repatriate. If that's a solid factor, how would you go about, if an agency needed to fund a conservation action, where could those dollars be best applied to lead towards recovery or at least stabilization of the population? Clearly, there's a lot of threats. And so how can those threats be mitigated? And so I'm giving sort of a big picture because I don't have the exact specifics and I'm not familiar enough with the recovery or the draft recovery plan. But there may be some items in there, Omar, that you guys could identify as being sort of this transition from research to conservation. And TxDOT is quite open to finding or funding or facilitating the best solution. And anything in this research agenda that can help define those actionable conservation actions would be real beneficial. Because I'll just close that US 83 that Omar presented with the old vent downstream. At some level, I mean, that's a great conservation action to remove that, and it won't come. I mean, TxDOT's already put that into the consultation, but not every bridge has that kind of opportunity awaiting it. And so how we plan forward would be useful, I think, to us and maybe any other conservation entities. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for that, Mark. And to do a slightly sidebar to this, one of the big points of the Comptroller's office getting involved in this is to help folks realize that there are other folks that are dealing with the same issues, and hopefully with that synergy, help build and move towards conservation. So that what we really don't want to do is fund research that is in a silo and doesn't, is not known about and useful for others. So that, thank you, Mark. That's a perfect example of the kind of work that we can fund work that can then help inform conservation actions that can then be funded, which helps everybody. And so to bring it back, yeah, to Kevin and Omar, I mean, obviously, it would be a huge help if we could, for the assessment on the status of the species, if we could get some redundancy. How far along is it on? I mean, obviously, how, a couple ice chests full of fish were put in below Possum Kingdom, but it doesn't sound like they've their descendants are still around. Is there work to be done down there on the assessing the viability and basically the how to repopulate that reach?
Kevin, you want me to go?
Yeah, go ahead, Omar. That'd be great.
Kevin's about to turn his camera off. First, I want to thank Mark for his thoughtful statement and questions. TxDOT's been a great partner in many projects, and we appreciate their perspective and looking toward conservation goals for the future and helping us out in the effort for recovery. And that could extend, for the whole length of the Brazos and not just the upper Brazos. I'll let Kevin. It's my understanding, yeah, that the species didn't survive down there. I believe the last time sharpnose were caught in the lower Brazos was around 2003. Some natural ones about that time.
When you say the lower, Omar, how low are you talking?
Well, past it was quite past Whitney. The lower Brazos would be downstream of Whitney, but this was closer to College Station area, I believe. Yeah. Because of the lab down there at A&M. So what's generally happened is to be able to promote a population in that area is that we got to have the habitat to support them, and the consequence of the three major impoundments, Granbury, Whitney, and Possum Kingdom on the Brazos River has resulted in some drastic changes downstream, mainly incising of the banks. Right downstream of some of those reservoirs, it's gravel-based bottom because they retain sediment. And so it's changed quite a bit and likely doesn't continue to support the species in most of the areas. You can see sometimes some of the aerial images downstream of Whitney, there appears to be some remnants of some sandy bottomed areas and flattened out areas, but they may not be of the linked requirements to support the species. And so right now what we have is just by way of understanding that they don't exist there, or they pretty much are extirpated, that the conditions aren't right. And so research into, making that, one, could they exist there, or in other places, or two, what could we do as far as habitat improvements to restore those areas, to bring back the habitat requirements for the species. That would be needed at first, rather than just having a captive propagation and continuing to release out there without any results. Kevin, do you want to add to that?
Well, I think that the most viable reach for repatriation or reintroduction experiments is downstream of Possum Kingdom. BRA surrendered their hydropower permit, so there's no longer any peaking hydropower out of there. There's a flow agreement in place. Yes, indeed, downstream there's, it releases fairly clear water, a little bit cooler than ambient conditions. Although now, I think Tiffany could confirm that there's a little bit of flexibility in water temperature. And, there are some mussels in that reach as well. Shoal chub still exists in that reach. And we chose to, one of our reintroduction experiments was to put Plains minnow in there. It was, I don't know, Tiffany knows better than I do that that's a tough reach to sample, depending upon the flow conditions. So, I think that would be a really important research objective, is to understand how that reach might be suitable versus some other reach that wouldn't be. And, as I mentioned earlier, the conservation contingency planning project with Josh Perkin is underway, and a little delay from COVID, but we should have right now it expires in 2022, but we might need to extend it. Josh, I don't know if you're on the call or not, but and what would Tim Bonner say about that? Those reaches the river for prairie minnows.
Yeah. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, hello, this is Tim. I don't know if Josh was going to say something, but no, I definitely think that there's the potential to be able to stock and for them to do well below PK. And then also, when I think about the lower Brazos, I'm thinking somewhere downstream around, starting around Highway 21 area. Let's get past where the Little River's coming in. And so, yeah, I think both of those are viable areas to start thinking about reintroduction sites.
And so just to, how do you approach that kind of a question? Do you just throw up and see what happens? Do you, is it just trying to give people a sense of viability and timelines and resources? By people, I mean myself.
You were breaking up a little bit there, Colin.
Oh, I apologize. What would be involved with a study to see if fish can be repatriated?
Yeah. So, in my opinion, I would be hesitant on experiments of releasing just and to see if they survived, rather than and having some sort of measurements on habitat, stream length, water velocity, all the components of the stream. Are they there necessary before we put fish in them? That's my thinking. We've got, as Kevin mentioned, the Perkins study going on right now that may shed a lot of light for that. So potentially the results of that may give us a little bit more confidence on where we think reintroduction is likely to be successful. So that, you know, that could be years off, I'm sure, but more information on that would be welcomed as far as studies and on the habitat quality before we, and then of course also we're going to need, you know, a population or a decision, I guess, on whether we have releases based on translocation. That would mean moving species or individuals from the upper Brazos to another area, or housing them in a fish hatchery or another location and using those rather than wild populations. And I think Mike Montaigne might want to add to that question.
And just before we grab to Mike, excuse me, but Omar, there's a question. Is it possible these could be classified as experimental populations? And we're not going to hold you to it, but just there's a question in the chat.
Well, yeah, obviously within the ESA 10J allows for experimental populations. That's a special rule, so it's a rulemaking that goes through the regulatory process. There's other avenues, or at least one other avenue that I'm aware of, that it could be done without a special rule, but that's the other consideration. So aside, if we're just talking about research, that's what I had said previously. The regulatory matter, and that's another hurdle to get through, but we can navigate that when it comes time.
Okay, excellent. Mike?
Yeah, can you hear me okay?
Yes, and would you introduce yourself?
Sure, I'm Mike Montaigne. I'm the project leader for the Texas Fish and Wildlife Conservation Office, which is U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. And I just wanted to chime in, you know, everybody, we tend to start throwing fish in before we really should in a lot of situations, and it costs a lot of money, and it costs a lot of effort by a lot of people. There really needs to be a lot of flow work done, habitat work done, and things like that. I mean, they went extinct there for a reason, and that reason probably hasn't changed. And therefore, you really have to have some sort of change in what's going on there, be it flow, habitat restoration, and all the things associated with that. Obviously, you say it's not really a sandy bottom anymore. It's probably got a bunch of sediment locked up behind Possum Kingdom Dam. And so there's a lot of issues that are going to be going on there that have not changed. And just throwing fish out there is an expensive, it seems easy to do, but it's an expensive thing to do. And then in the end, you realize that you still have to do all that other work too. So it's all got to be kind of done at the same time, or prior to putting the fish in there, if you're going to expect any kind of good results of just throwing fish back in. We've seen that in other places. It's not just my opinion. That's just kind of the way it goes. If you don't change the habitat to be more suitable for those fish, they're just not gonna stick around. They're gonna wink out again. So that's just my 2 cents on throwing fish in there without doing a whole lot of work before that ever happens.
No, I very much appreciate that. There's a definition of insanity in there. Joshua, your name's come up.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
I just wanted to give an update since we're doing the funded work, and Kevin had mentioned potential delays. So, you know, part of the ecological forecasting and conservation contingency planning grant was to go out and collect data to validate some species distribution models. We were supposed to be out last summer. There was a moratorium on travel. So we hope to be out this summer, and we have collected some data. Of course, we don't know what the rest of the summer holds for us in terms of flow and weather. And so if we can't collect our validation data this summer, then certainly we hope to get it next summer. But in terms of planning reintroduction, I think the place we start is a model based on the habitat features that we know to be important to these species, you know, including kind of the larger guild of pelagic broadcast spawners. And so we will produce that model. That's something that we're on the hook to do, and we will deliver that. I think that's the first place to start. And then the idea of reintroductions in the lower part of the Brazos. I like the idea of following where the Macrohybopsis, where the chub species still persists. That's a pelagic broadcast spawning guild member, we're pretty certain. And it does tend to kind of follow what the other fish do to some extent. And then sometimes the chub's an outlier in terms of stream length or response to drought. So I think the models that we're producing, and then eventually reintroduction experiments may be appropriate. I'm just following on Mike's comment, like we don't want to be putting fish back into places where they're never going to make it. That's a waste of everyone's time. But there is this idea of a historical contingency, or these historical disturbance events that can cause isolated populations to become extirpated. And drought is the biggest one. And we have data in Texas that this has happened in all the way up through the Great Plains. Like we know these fish get knocked down during drought. Sometimes the populations become extirpated. And then in an unfragmented system without reservoirs, they could just recolonize on their own. And so I think for reintroductions, one thing we need to decide first before we start moving a lot of fish is, is there evidence for a historical event that might have contributed to extirpation, assuming that the model predicts the species might persist there? And I think Kevin May's point that, we might actually be able to manipulate flows, or at least we're released from flows that we know to be problematic for these species, these hydropeaking flows. If there's been an improvement in flow, that is a great start for these species, in my opinion. So just to wrap it up, we will have models that could be used to make some initial decisions about where we might consider reintroductions or repatriations. And then, of course, I think there is some research that has to be done to determine if that's, a direction we want to put investments in. You're still muted, Colin.
I made it so far. Tiffany, a lot of talk about dams here. Is there?
Oh, no, I was just going to say, I agree wholeheartedly that stretch between PK and Granbury, the upper half of it from, say, the 281 crossing north, is very rocky bottom further down. Than it does get more sandy. So that might be, we have been conducting in that stretch for a long time now, significant fish, mussel, riparian zone, channel change, habitat assessments to create a long-term baseline data set, which we just kind of collected or close to finishing, having, our number of events that we thought would be needed for statistical significance. So we do have a good data set out there. It's raw data, but we do have that. That is monitoring. We will continue on a periodic basis in perpetuity. So there is potential if there's things that we need to add to generate data to help with these research efforts, let us know. In that stretch, we just signed this week a contract to start doing some significant Brazos water snake research that we're coordinating with Parks and Wildlife that will also generate a lot of habitat data in that stretch. So there may be information that we can provide that will help make some of those decisions. We just don't have it published. That's not really what we do, but we're willing to share that data. We're also doing the same between Glen Rose and Whitney, which I really don't think from the discussion we've heard has much of any potential for supporting these fish. And we're doing similar studies down in Fort Bend County in the Richmond and Rocheron area. So we do have some data there. Granted, it's collected for a very different purpose, but we are generally collecting all the things I've heard discussed here. You're muted again, Colin.
All right, second time. So thank you, everyone. To provide a bit of a recap here, there is significant work that is underway for modeling habitat needs for a collection of fish that includes the shiners. There is potential downstream, but there's obviously a reason the fish aren't there now. It wasn't that long ago that they were there, so it's not unreasonable to think that they could return. But the reason we're here is this is not an easy situation. There is I'm continually amazed to work on the species where there is actually a lot of baseline data already established that could be easily, that lays the groundwork for continuing monitoring and the power of that. Obviously, the best time to start long-term monitoring was 20 years ago, and the second best time is now, just like planting trees. So I'm hearing those things are strong. It sounds like the monitoring could feed into to help a lot of these other questions. And what I'm, just to be blunt, what I'm looking for are very easily to define, understandable projects that can help, advance this discussion. It doesn't necessarily have to be. We've tried this before. We've tried to answer all questions for all things at once, and it turns out that that's a difficult thing to do. And so I want to get people's feedback on if it sounds like I'm summarizing accurately what's happening here. Mark?
Yeah, thanks. I just had one more question actually for you in the comptroller's office, Colin, and that is in your scope, and I'm not asking for commitment language, obviously, just is it viable that the comptroller could fund research that would develop the approved plan that then would just be left pending implementation? And then the second part of that question, is it in your scope that the comptroller could acquire if it's determined that an experimental population authorization is needed? Is that something that's within the comptroller's program scope? Thanks.
The comptroller's office historically has developed conservation plans. What we've found is that it's much more efficient to provide the information and the conversation and the dialogue for that conservation plan to be developed, and then the stakeholders who are the ones who are actually going to end up holding that, holding the permit and developing the plan, do it, right? It's just if it's your skin in the game, if it's your skin in the game, that should be that plan should be yours. It also sounds like for this one in particular, there is a lot of information that's relevant to a broad group of stakeholders that we can provide, but everybody has a different conservation plan need, right? What they're looking for in conservation regulatory assurance for is different. And so my boss is on this line, so she can jump in. But what we have found to be most effective is address the questions, get the information out there, get the conversation going, or enable not that the conversation has not already been going, but take it that far.
Well, let me rephrase maybe. Could the comptroller fund a site-specific recovery reintroduction plan?
Yeah, it sounds like yes, but we
not
would
a whole
need,
scale. I'm sorry, not a whole scale conservation plan. Those get to be big umbrellas sometimes that aren't necessarily.
Yeah, but if you could define a reach of a river and say, okay, we're going to develop a plan to reintroduce the fish here. It technically yes, but it's on this. We'd be very hesitant on that because if it was framed as an experiment for like, okay, let's see if we can make this happen. It sounds like it's pretty clear we don't have the baseline information that we need yet to run that experiment. And we'd be more interested in developing that information and then going forward because we don't want to.
This is Megan. Can you hear me, Colin?
Yes.
Yeah, I just, I'll jump in and kind of echo what Colin was saying. At this point, we're really interested in figuring out what the research needs are, and focusing on that and pulling that together, and then that could inform recovery plans. It could inform conservation plans. But at this point, I think we're at the stage where we just want to figure out what kind of research could we at the comptroller's office fund that could help us to gain a better understanding of the species across the board.
And that makes sense. I guess, though, given that we're talking about 2 listed species, it seems to me that we are in need of trying to figure out recovery. And so that's why I keep kind of coming back around to that point. But enough said. I think you got my point that if there was a ability to get all the research questions answered for an actionable plan, I think that would be of benefit to action agencies. And I'll leave it there. Thank you.
All right, Cody.
Hey, Colin.
Hello.
So I think a lot of emphasis has been put on reintroduction, and I think most everybody agrees on the reach at the very least to first start trying this reintroduction. But I still think there's a lot of questions that need to be answered, or there's opportunities for research in the range that they occupy now. I think to frame a little bit of what Mr. Spears with City of Lubbock to his concerns, I think you can frame that in research questions. So, what are the water quality, water qualities that these fish associate with, especially, I guess, related to some of the threats that the SSA points out, like point non-source point pollution. So you could do some research on some sites, that may be affected by that and may not be affected by that. You could look at, there's also water quality related to golden algae and those potential threats. And then also, I know in the SSA, it was mentioned potential sediment load reduction in dams. So those are all, I think, water quality issues that could be addressed in the native occupied reach right now that that could inform reintroductions to different locations. And some of that, it sounds like, may already be researched by Dr. Perkin, but I think there's opportunities there.
Thank you. David Dunn. Oh, and so everyone, you had your hand up? And well, we're waiting for that.
Yeah, this is David. Can you hear me?
Yes. Would you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name's David Dunn. I'm with HDR, and I've been involved with some of these issues on behalf of some projects or some clients over the years, and I've always found these interesting topics for us to deal with. The question I have is, and this is maybe asking for some conjecture on parts of our biologists, but we look at habitat. The habitat in the lower Brazos is obviously very different than the habitat in the upper Brazos, but it's always been very different than the upper Brazos. The habitat in the lower Brazos has changed over the years. You're right; it's become more incised. There's less sediment moving through the system, but you still have a sand bed stream when you get down below, as high up as Bryan College Station and further down. So the question I have is sort of a water quality issue, but also a predator species question. I've read in the upper Brazos that they tend to gravitate, or at least can handle, areas of higher salinity that many of their predator species won't handle, and that keeps them away from sources of predation. That's obviously not going to happen in the lower Brazos. Have there been an increase in predator species that may have knocked that native population down in the lower Brazos, or is that completely off basis? And I guess maybe that's a question for Kevin or someone else who's done a lot more of the research than.
I'm not sure how to accurately address that. I mean, it's a possibility. There's probably more predators in the upper than historically, given that Possum Kingdom is there producing predators. They move up, they move down, they probably get too salty, and then they turn around and go back down, or they die. in the lower Brazos, there probably could be enough data to examine whether or not predators have increased through time. There is one thought that the lower Brazos was pretty much always a sink for species that have these long these migration requirements. So as you know, perhaps they go downstream following a drought, or during a drought they follow the water downstream. Some don't make it back up because of issues like you're identifying, predators, maybe the habitat's different, etc. But now with the series of reservoirs in place, it's not possible. So.
All right.
Okay.
Well, thank you. Yeah. No, Dave, that was it. Very much appreciate the question. It does highlight the just how much fun biology is. So what I would like to do now is, because we have 2 minutes left for this meeting, again, thank all of our presenters and everyone who participated in this discussion and listened in. What I'll be doing over the next 2 weeks is summarize, reviewing this meeting, reaching out to folks, asking them questions, and trying to come up with a general understanding of what this is. You'll see in the chat that I put my contact information and also the contact information for our program. If you would, if there's an issue that you weren't able to bring up today and would like to, please reach out to me. But basically, over the next month, what I'll be doing is summarizing this conversation here. I think we've made enough progress that we can reach out, and we don't need a second follow-up meeting for this, but we can move forward with outlining some key questions, and then what we'll also do is set up a listserv that's through Gov Delivery, just like we have how you got onto this one, but it'll be specific for prairie fishes, and that will include the shiners, and we'll continue the communication that way. So no further ado, unless there's other questions or follow-up. Sorry, that was too rambling, but basically the question is, look to your inboxes for a summary of this meeting and an invitation to the listserv. There'll be just to talk about prairie fish and the shiners, and we'll continue the communication through that channel. So thank you so much. And with that, I will say I'll end the recording.
Thanks, Colin.
Thank you, Colin.
Thank you.
Yep. Thanks, Colin.